Hey, welcome to kinematics lesson on calculating speed and velocity. Let's begin. Speed is a scalar quantity. Speed is a measure of distance traveled over a given period of time. Speed is calculated by the following formula. V equals d over t, where v equals speed in meters per second, d equals distance in meters, and t equals time in seconds. Velocity, on the other hand, is a vector. Velocity is a measure of the change in displacement over time. Velocity is calculated by the following formula. The symbol is also a V but has an arrow above it, and it's equal to delta D. Notice the delta symbol in front of D, which indicates that it is a change in position, and this should have a little arrow above it to indicate that it is a vector as well. So displacement is also a vector. So delta D equals displacement measured in meters, and delta T equals time in seconds. Recall that displacement is calculated by the following equation. Delta D equals D final minus D initial, which you learned in a previous lesson. So D final is your final position and D initial is your initial position. So the equation for velocity becomes V equals D final minus D initial over delta T. Okay, problem solving strategy. So you're going to start learning to solve problems in physics, and there's general strategies that you can use to approach solving questions like these. Generally speaking, you need to read the question carefully. You can construct a diagram in physics because most questions pertain to physical examples, real life scenarios that you can picture, imagine, and draw pictures of. Determine the information given. What do you know? Determine what you're trying to find out, the unknown variable, and use the most suitable equation by examining the given information and the unknown. Solve by substituting the known information, and then check your final answer. Here's an example question. An object travels 20 meters in 5 seconds. Calculate the speed of the object. So we write the word given, and I want you to follow these steps when you do these problems. Write given and write down the information that you have in the question. Sometimes this can be a little more challenging than you might suspect. So it says the object travels 20 meters, so that's your distance. And it says it travels in 5 seconds. So you can look at the units. The units will tell you what the measurement is. So seconds is time. So t equals 5 seconds. And it says calculate the speed of the object. So that's what we're looking for. We're looking for v are unknown. So you can write v with a question mark. Then we need the relevant equation to use to solve. So v equals d over t. And the solution, we plug in our numbers and we get 4 meters per second. Here's another example question where we're calculating velocity instead of speed. So an object changes its position by 20 meters east in 5 seconds. Calculate the velocity of the object. So we write down the given information. This time instead of d, we write delta d. And we should put an arrow above it to indicate that it is displacement, a vector. Notice that it has a direction associated with it. And then time equals 5 seconds. Our unknown is v, the velocity, which is the same symbol as speed, but with an arrow above it. And then we calculate it, and we get 4 meters per second east. So notice that velocity includes a direction and speed does not. Velocity uses displacement, whereas speed uses distance. That's the difference between the two. So later, in this case, the magnitude of speed and velocity was the same. It was 4 meters per second, but in some cases, it will not be the same, and we will see examples of that later. The equations can be rearranged to solve for time and displacement. So the equation, if you're solving for displacement, the equation becomes delta d equals v times delta t. Or if you're solving for time, it becomes delta t equals delta d over v. Now, I'm going to show you how to do this algebraically. So the original equation is v equals delta d over delta t. Now, if we're solving for displacement, what we have to do is we have to get delta d by itself on the left-hand side of the equation. So what we do to one side of an equation, if we do the same thing to the other side, the equation stays equal and it's still the same equation. So here we have delta t in the denominator, so we have to multiply the right side by delta t in order to cancel it out and get delta d by itself. And if we multiply the right side by delta t, we have to multiply the left side by delta t as well. So this cancels this one, and then we flip the equation and we get delta d equals v times t. That becomes our second equation. This is our, and that is the equation for delta d. Now, if we want to solve for t, we can just use this same equation and do one more step to it to solve for time. So delta d equals v times t. And in order to get rid of the t on the right-hand side, I have to divide by t. And if I divide the right-hand side by t, I have to divide the left-hand side by t. So t cancels, and then I flip the equation, and the equation becomes v equals delta d over t. If you're not super strong with algebra, then you can plug in numbers first into equations and then rearrange, but this is how you solve it algebraically. So this becomes our third equation. On a test, you're only going to be given this equation. You have to remember how to rearrange it. So this is the only one you will have. So here's an example question. John paddles his canoe 450 meters across a lake. If his average velocity is 2.5 meters per second, how long does it take them to cross? So we write out our given information. In this case, we have our delta D is 450. And we're looking, and we have our velocity, it's 2.5 meters per second. And it says how long does it take them to cross. So how long does it take them means how much time. So we're looking for delta t. Then the equation we're using is delta t equals delta d over v. And then we plug in our values to solve, and we get 180 seconds. Now another way to do this is to plug in the numbers first. If you're more familiar with that from math class, you might be more used to doing it this way. So the equation is delta D over delta T. And so if we plug in our values, we get 2.5 equals 450 divided by time. So you can put the numbers in first, and then you can multiply both sides by t and divide by 2.5 to get t on its own. So t equals 450 divided by 2.5. So if it helps, you can plug the numbers in first and then rearrange it. Okay, that concludes part one of calculating velocity and speed. I want you to try part one of the question worksheet now. When you're done, show Mr. Johal, and then you can proceed to part two of the notes and video.